It's 1925, and you're standing behind a fake bookshelf in the back of a Chicago cigar shop, waiting for someone to knock the right pattern on a steel door. You don't know it yet, but the next 10 seconds decide whether you spend the rest of your life sweeping floors or running blocks. Because Prohibition didn't kill Chicago's drinking culture. It built an empire on top of it. When the Volstead Act shut down every legal bar in the country on January 17, 1920, Chicago didn't slow down. It went underground and multiplied. Within a few years, the city had somewhere north of 7,000 speakeasies, more watering holes operating illegally than had ever operated legally before the law existed, and almost all of them, one way or another, answered to the same organization. This is what it actually took to survive inside it, rank by rank. Lookout. You're 11 years old, and your job is to stand on a street corner in Little Italy and do nothing but watch. You don't touch the liquor. You don't touch the money. You watch for a police uniform, a stranger's face that doesn't belong, a car that circles the block twice. If you see one, you whistle, or you kick a can, or you just run. And somewhere behind you, a door closes and a light switches off before anyone official gets close enough to see anything. Kids on street corners were the outfit's first warning system, an unpaid, disposable network spread across entire neighborhoods. Most of them were paid in candy, in coins, sometimes in nothing but the promise that one day, if they kept their mouths shut long enough, somebody would remember their name. Some of them did get remembered, most of them didn't. And the ones who talked, even by accident, even to a parent, found out fast that the organization's patience for mistakes ran out long before its reach did. Runner. If you survived being a lookout without drawing attention, you might get handed something heavier. A satchel, a crate, a set of directions to a building you were told never to describe out loud. Runners moved product between warehouses, breweries, and speakeasies, usually on foot or bicycle. Sometimes in a modified car with the back seat gutted out to hide bottles under the floorboards. It sounds simple. It wasn't. Runners were the most exposed people in the entire operation, visible on the street, carrying evidence, with almost no protection if a rival gang or a federal agent decided to stop them. Between 1920 and 1933, hundreds of low-level operatives like this were arrested, beaten, or simply disappeared, and their names rarely made it into any newspaper. The people above them didn't cry over it. A runner was replaceable within a day. What wasn't replaceable was the shipment, and if you lost it, you didn't get a second chance to prove yourself. You got a warning that came exactly once. Speakeasy operator. Make it far enough, and you might get your own door, a real one, with a peephole and a password that changed every few weeks. Running a speakeasy meant managing the front-facing side of the entire business, pouring drinks, keeping the band playing, keeping the police paid off just enough to look the other way, and keeping regular customers happy enough that they never talked to the wrong person about what they'd seen inside. Places like the Four Deuces on South Wabash Avenue operated as a full ecosystem: bar downstairs, gambling on the second floor, and rooms above that for anything the operation wanted to sell. Being an operator meant walking a line every single night. Too quiet, and you weren't making money. Too loud, and you were inviting a raid. And raids happened constantly. Chicago police conducted thousands of them across the decade, most resulting in nothing more than a fine and a wink, because so many of the officers doing the raiding were already being paid by the very operation they were supposedly shutting down. Bootlegger. Above the people selling the liquor were the people who made sure there was liquor to sell in the first place. Bootleggers ran the supply chain. Breweries disguised as legitimate businesses. Trucks running routes from Canada down through Michigan and Indiana into Chicago. Boats crossing the Great Lakes under cover of night. This was where the real money started, and where the real danger started too. Because a truck full of product moving down an open highway wasn't just a target for police. It was a target for every rival gang in the city who wanted that shipment for themselves. Hijackings were common enough that some operations began sending decoy trucks, empty vehicles sent out first to draw fire, while the real shipment took a different route entirely. If you ran bootlegging routes long enough without losing a shipment or a driver, you'd proven something the organization valued more than loyalty, that you were useful and that you were lucky. In this business, those were treated as the same quality. Enforcer. Every operation this size needs people willing to make problems disappear, and enforcers were exactly that. The muscle sent when a debt went unpaid, a rival gang got too close to outfit territory, or someone talked when they shouldn't have. This is the rank where the job stopped being about product and started being about violence as a management tool. Chicago's gang wars during Prohibition were brutal by any measure. Over 500 gang-related killings across the decade, most of them never solved, because witnesses had a way of forgetting everything the moment police started asking questions. The most infamous single act of enforcement in the entire era happened on February 14, 1929, when 7 members of a rival North Side gang were lined up against a garage wall on North Clark Street and shot dead by men dressed as police officers. Nobody was ever convicted for it. The message it sent didn't need a conviction to land. Capo. Survive long enough as an enforcer or a bootlegger and prove you can manage more than yourself, and you might be handed a territory, a set of blocks, a cluster of speakeasies, a piece of the supply chain that was now yours to run and yours to answer for. Capos operated almost like regional managers of an underground corporation, collecting money upward, distributing orders downward, and absorbing blame in either direction if something went wrong. It was, in a strange way, the most stable rank in the entire hierarchy, enough authority to matter, but rarely visible enough to become the next target in a war between bosses. That stability came at a price. Capos were expected to know everything happening in their territory at all times, and if a lookout got sloppy, a runner got caught, or a rival gang moved in on a single block without anyone noticing, it wasn't the lookout who paid for it first. It was you. Underboss. One level below the very top sat the underboss, the person trusted to run daily operations across the entire city, while the boss handled strategy, politics, and the increasingly delicate business of staying out of federal reach. This was less a job than a permanent negotiation between rival capos, corrupt officials, and a boss who needed absolute loyalty but rarely gave much of it back. Johnny Torrio held something close to this role in Chicago's underworld before eventually stepping into the top spot himself, and his approach became the blueprint the entire organization followed for years afterward. Treat the illegal alcohol trade like an actual business, minimize unnecessary violence when possible, and above all, keep the money moving upward without interruption. The underboss rank was powerful, profitable, and extremely dangerous because it was close enough to the top to be blamed for anything that went wrong, and far enough from the top to be expendable if it made the boss look better by comparison. Boss. And at the very top of all of it sat one man making decisions that rippled through every rank beneath him, down to the 11-year-old on the street corner who never once met him and never would. At the height of Chicago's Prohibition-era underworld, the organization was estimated to be pulling in somewhere around $100 million a year. Bootlegging, speakeasies, gambling, and prostitution combined into a single, disciplined operation, run out of a suite in the Lexington Hotel on Michigan Avenue, with the kind of open confidence that came from paying off enough of the city's police and politicians to operate almost in plain sight. For years, that money bought protection nobody official was willing to admit existed. But the top of the ladder was also the most exposed position in the entire structure. Every rank below the boss could disappear, get replaced, or walk away and start over somewhere else. The boss couldn't. Every enemy, every federal investigation, every reporter looking for a headline was eventually pointed at exactly one person. And when the government finally found a charge that stuck, it wasn't murder, it wasn't bootlegging, and it wasn't the 7 bodies on North Clark Street. It was tax evasion. In 1931, the man at the very top of this entire hierarchy was convicted not for anything he ordered done to other people, but for the money he never reported to the government at all. 11 years. most of it spent on an island in San Francisco Bay, about as far from Chicago as this rank had ever felt untouchable. So if you'd made it this far, through the corner, through the crates, through the doors and the debts and the war for territory, you'd have reached the top of an empire that was already, quietly, running out of time. Prohibition ended in December 1933. The speakeasies closed their fake bookshelves for good. The runners found other work, and the organization that had built itself rank by rank across an entire decade had to figure out, almost overnight, how to survive in a country where the one product it had built its empire on was suddenly legal again. If breakdowns like this are the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe and check out this next video, because the ranks you just climbed were only the beginning of the story.